China didn't design a new rocket. It copied SpaceX's engine for engine down to the stainless steel skin. That should have made this easier. Instead, in December 2025, a 2,000-person startup and a state contractor with over 100,000 employees each tried to land a booster for the first time. Same borrowed blueprint, same maneuver, both failed. The rocket that failed first lifted off from a pad in the Gobi Desert, 66 meters of stainless steel and methalox, 9 engines burning methane and liquid oxygen instead of the kerosene mix that powers most of the world's rockets still flying today. It carried nothing but a mass simulator. No real satellite on board, because this flight existed purely to test whether the vehicle itself worked. And for most of the flight, it worked. The second stage reached orbit clean on the first try, with a payload capacity close enough to a Falcon 9 that the comparison isn't a stretch. Nothing about the ascent gave any hint of what was coming. Here's the number nobody reported. Landspace's own flight commander, a man named Dai Zheng, said the booster's engine ignition began cleanly at 80 kilometers up. Everything before that point worked. The rocket steered itself toward a landing zone in Gansu province that covers 60 square meters, and it came down 40 meters from the center of that circle. 40 meters, out of a rocket that had just fallen from orbit. Dai's own words were blunt. If that last ignition had gone as planned, the vehicle lands dead center. It didn't. It exploded. Landspace called the flight a success. In its statement afterward, the company said the test achieved its expected technical objectives, that it had verified the recovery system, the engine, throttling, the attitude control. All true. None of it changes what the footage shows. A booster caught fire in mid-air and came apart on the desert floor. Call that whatever the press release wants. What actually happened was a failure precisely located 40 meters wide. 3 weeks later, it happened again to an organisation built nothing like Landspace. And the piece that connects the two isn't in either company's press release. It's a number most people never bothered to look up, and it's the reason this failure isn't really about engineering at all. Hold on to that. Long March 12A lifted off on December the 22nd from a different pad at the same spaceport complex, built by a completely different kind of company. Zhuke 3 came from Landspace, a private startup running on roughly 2,000 employees and venture capital. Long March 12A came from the Shanghai Academy of Spaceflight Technology, a division of CASC, China's main state rocket contractor, an organisation with more than 100,000 people on payroll. One answers to investors, the other answers to a ministry. That distinction is real, and CASC's second stage reached orbit fine, while its booster landing failed too, in the same window, for reasons the state contractor has disclosed almost nothing about publicly. State media reported only that the stage was not successfully recovered. No engine data, no meters off target figure, nothing resembling what Dai Zheng handed reporters within days of Zhuke 3's failure. But don't overstate that private versus state line either. Landspace is not independent of Beijing. Its own post-launch statement thanked the China National Space Administration, the Dongfeng Test Zone, and the Communist Party of China by name for their backing. The kind of language a fully independent company has no reason to include. This is privately capitalized, not politically unsupervised. What genuinely differs between the two companies is headcount, funding model, and the incentive to explain a failure in public. What doesn't differ is the outcome. Two organizations built on opposite ends of China's institutional spectrum independently arrived at the identical failure point in the same 3-week window on their first attempt at the same maneuver. And here's what tells you the most about both of them. No program got cancelled after either failure. No executive got replaced in public. No launch calendar visibly slipped. Both companies are already talking about their next attempt on a schedule that hasn't moved. That response only makes sense if both organisations went into December already treating a landing failure on Flight 1 as an acceptable, absorbable outcome rather than a crisis to manage. The fireball wasn't a surprise to the people who built the rocket. It was priced in before the countdown ever started. To find out why it was priced in, you have to look at the one piece of a copied Falcon 9 that no blueprint can hand over, the last 6 seconds before touchdown. But first, it is worth knowing neither company was new to this. Landspace already held one record before December, the first methane-fueled rocket ever to reach orbit back in 2023, beating both SpaceX and Blue Origin to that specific milestone with an earlier, expendable vehicle called Zhuk 2. That flight took the company 2 tries. Its first Zhuk 2 attempt in December 2022 failed to reach orbit when a second stage engine shut down early, and the second attempt 7 months later succeeded. CASC's lineage runs back further still to the state program that has flown Long March rockets since the 1970s, through crewed missions, lunar probes, and a permanently crewed space station now in orbit. Neither organisation was guessing at how to build a rocket or how to reach orbit reliably. Both had done that part before, more than once. What neither had done before December was land one. The wall isn't the fall. Getting a spent booster back through the atmosphere, roughly where you want it, is a solved problem: structure and aerodynamics, and a competent flight computer. Sippel, a launch vehicle analyst at the German Aerospace Centre, confirmed Zhuk 3's re-entry and guidance worked. The booster arrived close to its target, intact, at low supersonic speed. That's not spin. That's an independent technical read from someone with no stake in China's space program either way. What breaks is the very end. A rocket engine is built to burn fuel at a huge, steady rate, pushed in one direction. Landing asks it to do the opposite, relight in mid-air after sitting cold through the fall, then throttle down to a sliver of normal output, precisely enough that the vehicle's downward speed hits 0 the instant it touches ground. Engineers call it a hover slam because there's no hovering in it at all. It's less a landing than a catch, an engine trying to grab hold of tons of falling metal in the space of a few heartbeats. Too much thrust and the booster shoots back up or tips sideways. Too little and it's still falling fast enough to destroy itself. There is no room in that sequence to be a little bit off, and the engine isn't even the only system that has to get it right. The guidance computer is fighting crosswinds, correcting for a landing pad that's a moving target relative to the vehicle's own trajectory, and coordinating the throttle position with the grid fins steering the airframe, all inside the same few seconds. A Merlin engine on a Falcon 9 booster can run down to around 40% of its full output, and even that floor is barely low enough for a soft touchdown, which is why SpaceX shuts down all but one engine for the final burn, instead of throttling 9 at once. Zhuk 3's and Long March 12A's engines are chasing that same narrow window, on hardware with a fraction of the flight history Merlin had by the time Falcon 9 first landed. Wang Yanan, editor of Aerospace Knowledge magazine, laid out the suspect list after Zhuk 3's failure. Engine reliability itself, flame impingement on the rocket body. Whether the control and circuitry systems hold up under sudden load and temperature swings in that final second. A named engineer's specific technical shortlist, printed under his own byline, not a vague gesture at difficulty. That's the answer to the question sitting open since the top of this video. 2 unrelated organisations hit the identical wall because the one part of a copied design that doesn't transfer from a blueprint is the exact throttle curve, tuned to one specific engine, one specific mass, one specific descent profile. You can copy the shape of a solution, you cannot copy the years of tuning that made the shape work. That's also where the copycat advantage runs out, because SpaceX had to build that tuning from nothing. It spent roughly 5 years on this precise manoeuvre before it worked even once. And it wasn't a quiet 5 years. Grasshopper hops in Texas starting in 2012, low and slow, just proving an engine could throttle precisely enough to hover. Overwater descent tests through 2013 and 2014, with no landing pad in sight at all, just data. The first real attempt at landing on something came in January 2015 on a floating drone ship, and it hit hard and toppled. April 2015, A second attempt came in with too much lateral speed and tipped over on the deck. 2 more attempts in early 2016 came agonizingly close and still failed. One from a stuck landing leg latch, one from another hard landing. The first successful landing anywhere didn't come until December 21st, 2015 on solid ground at Cape Canaveral, the 8th landing attempt SpaceX had made since 2013. The first successful drone ship landing followed 4 months later. None of that patience was a luxury SpaceX started with either. Its predecessor, Falcon 1, failed its first 3 launches, and by the 4th attempt the company was reportedly weeks from running out of money entirely. That 4th launch succeeded in September 2008, which is the only reason there was a company left standing to spend 5 more years failing at landings in full public view. Patience is easier to praise in hindsight than it is to fund in real time, and China's constellation deadlines don't leave room to find out whether its own investors would tolerate the version of SpaceX that almost didn't survive to 2009. China is not in that position. Duke 3 and Long March 12A are not experimental architectures built from nothing. They are close copies of a maneuver SpaceX has now performed successfully more than 600 times. The physics is published, the failure modes are documented in a decade of SpaceX's own public blooper reel. Musk himself, watching Duke 3's preparation, said the design had borrowed pieces of Starship's stainless steel and Methalox approach, bolted onto a Falcon 9 style layout, and predicted it would take land space more than 5 years to reach Falcon 9's reliability. If you're copying a solved problem, 5 years is not a compliment. It's the same runway SpaceX needed to solve it from scratch, which means the copy isn't buying back the time it was supposed to buy back. There's an obvious pushback to that, and it deserves a straight answer instead of being waved off. Maybe copying doesn't actually save time the way this argument assumes, because landing precision isn't a property of the general concept, it's a property of the specific vehicle. A slightly different mass, a slightly different engine layout, a slightly different centre of gravity on descent, and the exact throttle curve SpaceX spent 5 years tuning for Merlin doesn't transfer cleanly to a Tianque 12A. New propellant, new engine, new structure, the argument goes, and none of that comes free just because the overall shape looks familiar. Under that reading, China isn't behind schedule at all, it's running roughly the timeline any new vehicle should expect. And the borrowed blueprint bought it exactly what it was always going to buy. A proven overall shape and nothing more specific than that. Sit with that for a second because it's a real argument, and if it's right, everything in this video up to this point is just describing an ordinary first flight and calling it a pattern. Here's where it doesn't hold. Sippel's read on Duke 3's re-entry and guidance, intact down to low supersonic speed on a first flight, is not the performance of a team starting from zero. Neither is reaching orbit clean on a maiden launch with an entirely new engine architecture. The parts of this system that were genuinely novel worked the first time. The one part that was supposed to be the least novel, copied most directly from a design SpaceX has flown hundreds of times, is the part that failed. That's the detail the any new vehicle takes years objection doesn't explain, and it's the reason the copying argument still carries more weight than the alternative. Now the failure stops being technical and starts being strategic. This is the number that's been on hold since the middle of this video. Analysts tracking China's filings with the International Telecommunication Union put Qianfan, one of 2 competing Chinese satellite internet constellations, on a path toward more than 15,000 satellites by 2030. To hit that number on the schedule those filings imply, the company would need to average roughly 7 launches a day, every day for the rest of the decade. Not 7 a month, 7 a day. Guowang, the state-run rival constellation, has its own ramp on file with the same regulator, climbing from 310 satellites by the end of 2026 to 3,600 a year by 2028. Starlink, the constellation both Chinese programs are built to compete with, already operates north of 12,000 satellites, built up using boosters that each fly a dozen times or more, build 15,000 satellites on expendable rockets instead, and every single one needs its own brand new booster, thrown away after one flight forever. China already knows that math doesn't close. Chinese state media itself reported the country closed out 2025 with 92 orbital launches total, a national record up from 68 the year before and still short of the 100 launch target the country had set for itself, almost entirely on expendable hardware. That's the busiest year any space program outside the United States has ever run, and it still wasn't enough to hit its own number. Layer Guoang's and Tianfan's launch requirements on top of a program already straining to clear 100 flights a year, and the math stops working long before the decade is out. Between the two constellations, China's total filings with the same regulator cover more than 200,000 satellites, a figure that functions less like a launch manifest and more like a claim staked on orbital territory before anyone else fills it. Ian Christensen, who studies commercial space policy at the Secure World Foundation, put the motivation plainly. China's reusability push exists primarily because of its own pursuit of Starlink-style mega-constellations, not because reusable rockets are a prestige project on their own. That is the calculation underneath both December failures. Run a slow, patient incremental test program the way SpaceX ran one, and China misses its own constellation deadlines by years. Skip straight to full orbital landing attempts on early flights, treat public failures as expensive data, and buy back the calendar time at the cost of a fireball or two. Both organizations made the second bet. The bet is rational. The fireballs are still real. A rational bet was never a promise of a clean outcome. It was a wager about which set of failures was cheaper to survive. 2026 opened rough, 2 failures in China's first 6 launches of the year, before any of the reusable programs even got back to the pad. Landspace is reportedly targeting an April retry with Zhuk 3. CASC has Long March 10 queued behind the 12A, eventually meant to carry crews toward China's own lunar program, which is aiming for a landing before 2030. Space Pioneer's Tianlong 3, built with a layout close enough to Falcon 9 that the resemblance is the whole point, has been rolled out to the pad at Jiuquan and back to the assembly building more than once, still waiting on its own first flight. Galactic Energy, iSpace, CAS Space, Deep Blue Aerospace and Orion Space are each developing their own version of the same landing sequence, and at least one company has already unveiled a sea-based drone barge, meaning the next round of attempts won't all be limited to the fixed desert pad. Both December flights used, none of that is retreat. It is several compressed test programs running in parallel instead of one patient one, which means more attempts bunched closer together and probably more public failures before the next real success. That was always the trade being made the moment China decided a borrowed design did not need SpaceX's 5 years to prove itself. 40 meters short, twice, in 19 days, is the current price of that bet. SpaceX needed 5 years and 8 attempts to close that same 40 meters down to 0. China is trying to close it faster on hardware it did not have to invent, and the calendar has billed it 2 rockets so far, with nothing landed yet.